One of the frequent criticisms I get here on this channel is the accusation that I'm quote-unquote too political, or quote, filtering everything through an intersectional studies degree, the latter of which I can assure you I have not studied in school. I'm entirely an autodidact in such things. Thank you very much. That said, these people often miss the point, I think, and it's about time I do a video to talk about why. This one's gonna be a bit different, as although I've done a ton of still ongoing research into politics and its intersection with Athenian religion, that ocean is so deep and vast that I'd rather talk now about the modern implications of these conversations on our communities, because ultimately, it's not the ancients I'm here to help, it's modern people who want to connect with the gods. That said, I think many of these points apply to all communities, though the method I'll use to make them is inherently theistic as my primary audience tends to be polytheist. With that in mind, let's do this. Karate! I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Ikeda Hakubi, who, against my wishes mind you, decided to toss me enough of a donation to replace the dead RAM in my work computer. Unfortunately, it appears the motherboard and other components might have been affected by whatever fried the RAM, as the restarting issue is still ongoing. So we're still testing the old PC, and I'm using my gaming computer for work in the meantime, which is not really an ideal situation for work-life balance and, being able to recognize the difference between work and not work. Thank you, as always, for your incredible support and allyship, Ikeda. With that out of the way, I'm first going to remind all of you that as much as I create work to share with my audience and hope that what I do enriches your lives, this is ultimately my channel, and I'm going to talk about topics that interest me, including politics. That said, I think that conversations often deemed political, such as those about mental health, disability awareness, trans rights, legal rights and representation for minority religions, folkism, latent Christianity, political violence, etc., are essential to anyone who wishes to help foster or teach within a religious community. Hellenic religion in ancient times was intertwined with governance in ways that make the two seem near indistinguishable in many aspects. The governing bodies of many city-states worked directly with temples to create the polis festival calendars and auctioned off the priesthood positions to citizens who desired to fill them. When seers were consulted by the government for major decisions, it was these same governing bodies who decided what seer to consult and when, though once the decision was made, the word of the oracle or seer was considered legally binding in Athens. Government officials could, and often did, lead certain ritual processions as often as priests, and priests worked with the government on organizing and collecting the offerings from surrounding areas for larger festivals like the Panathenaia and Dionysia. Funerals, marriages, rites of passages, and other religious ceremonies had governmental regulations placed on them. For example, in my video on ancestor worship, I talked about how Solon put limitations on the size and length of funerary rites, as well as where the processions were allowed to go, due to the way in which the women who organized them would often use the ritual as a way to call their relatives into political action. Pan-Hellenic festivals had government representatives in attendance from the neighboring city-states, whether they were at war or allied, because it was thought that the gods came first above human squabbles for such occasions. Governments also regulated who had access to the temples and when, for what purpose, what was allowed to be offered, and what the standards were for those offerings to be in compliance with kalos. Now, to some folks, this might look like I'm arguing for a religious component to governance, which isn't necessarily what's going on here. But what I'd like to point out is that Hellenism itself has been political since ancient times. And when you're talking about a modern revivalist movement, how we define ourselves is essential, especially when you're talking about the treatment of vulnerable minority groups such as the trans community or folks with disabilities. Those who would call for total unity and ignoring quote-unquote politics, emphasis on the quotes here, are essentially calling for these people to be shuttered. I will not ally with folkists or worship alongside them, as I cannot stand side by side with people who would claim that I and others like me are LARPers who could never connect with the gods without Greek help. I cannot stand side by side with those who would deny the rights of trans people to exist or deny their identities. Not only because I'm gender fluid myself, but even when I considered myself an ally prior to the realization of my identity, I understood that an explicit declaration by a creator or community on this issue, the willingness to say exactly where you stand, creates a measure of safety and community cohesion that is lacking without it. I cannot stand beside those who would mock or harm those in the disabled community, and frequently take steps within my power to make my work more accessible to them when possible. This is part of why I create in the video format in the first place. As much as some would decry the term safe space, to me at least, it is an affront to the gods to tell them who can and cannot worship them as they see fit. But it's also my responsibility, as someone who helps to run an interfaith community in the form of my Discord server, who teaches practical applications to modern worshippers of historical scholarship on ancient tradition, to make clear where I stand as a creator and a reluctant leader in said community. I refuse to shy away from the reality of ancient superstitions, such as the racist attitudes towards non-citizens and those who didn't speak Greek as a first language, the frequent genocidal tendencies towards babies born with birth defects and genetic diseases, the sexist laws and tendencies, especially in Athens, towards women, the shunning of LGBTQ expression outside of very limited specific examples in culture as opposed to myth. One of the beautiful things, though, about revived traditions is our ability to learn from the mistakes of the past and continue with the knowledge of the present firmly in mind. We no longer have need for the belief that birth defects are a punishment from the gods on parents, as we understand the genetic basis for them and have treatments available for many that can allow folks to live stable and happy lives. With the basic understanding of mental health topics such as neurodivergence, we can correct the mistakes of the past and worship alongside those who would have been deemed unworthy or impious due to differences in neurochemistry. As I've said many times in many different venues, just because the ancients held bigoted views doesn't mean we need to carry on their mistakes in modern traditions. But for this point, I'll take it a bit further. The gods were said to have imbued humans with the gift of reason, and in ancient times, the sciences were a part of philosophy, all of which were considered sacred. To ignore modern scientific advances and understanding would be spitting in the face of the gods for the gifts that they've given us. As important as tradition, kata ta patria, was to ancient Greeks, and as important as it can be for those of us reviving and reconstructing these traditions, the conversations about who we are and what we allow are just as essential, because defining who we are out the gate allows for growth and understanding within widely diverse communities. The ultimate hubris, in my view, is deciding for the gods whom they have called and whom they haven't. However, as community members and stewards, these conversations are essential as well for the protections of ourselves as members of these communities. If someone causes direct harm in my spaces, telling them they are not welcome is not the same as telling them not to worship the gods or that their way is wrong or not of the tradition, as folkists often do. It is simply telling them that they can't do so here, where they have caused or can cause direct harm with their beliefs. Most modern Hellenists come to the tradition from Christianity or other monotheist faiths. Some make a pit stop in another tradition before they hear or feel the call from the gods. Some come from atheism, but all of us are constantly subjected to perpetual judgment and abuse for being different. Why should we continue to subject our own communities to that judgment and abuse? Abuse that many of us left our formal faiths in part to escape. Do we know better than the gods who serves them in ways that are pleasing? I'll reiterate that point as often as I must to make it stick, as the torrent of abuse that I and others have received from those who believe they know better than the gods stands testament to the pervasiveness of this particular form of hubris in the community. The loudest voices in the community are those that are most likely to be heard by those outside as defining that community. The loudest voices within a tradition will define that tradition. Due to the quality of my work and how few people are doing similar work in shared spaces, I've managed to acquire a rather loud voice within the Hellenist community, and as such, I feel the responsibility to project that voice within the community, to protect and enrich those who are most vulnerable. Any tradition's future is dependent on how that tradition defines itself in the present, how the members are treated, and who is allowed to participate. Ethno-nationalists and folkists are going to define their traditions in such a narrow way that the future of those traditions will forever sit in doubt, if nothing else, but because defining by blood and location as an authoritative factor will by its very nature limit those who can participate and thereby the longevity of the tradition. The gods have always called those on the fringes. In ancient times, entire civilizations sang their names in praise, city-states funded their worship directly, and so did the citizenry. This is no longer true. Greece is largely Christian, and my Greek friends will loudly and confidently tell you the movements towards polytheism in Greece are largely darkened by ethno-nationalism and folkism. It falls to those of us with loud voices in the Hellenist space to make everyone, Greek or not, disabled, trans, gay, straight, cis, minority, or majority, feel confident and stable in their desire to worship these incredible beings. The gods call whom they call, but it falls to us as a community to give those called a welcoming space to land, ease of access to information to create confidence following that call, and a supportive environment to build relationships of goddess with the gods. The essence of polytheism is pluralistic. Many traditions were founded in ancient times with many different emphases on various pantheons. Some gods and epithets were only honored in specific places. I've expressed support in the past for eclecticism, reconstructionism, revivalism, multi-traditionalism, and syncretism, because all of these approaches are going to be essential for the longevity of the tradition. The demands and requirements of the modern day are radically different than in ancient times, and much as in ancient times, a plurality of approaches is required to make worship accessible to all of those who are called. Ultimately, the validity of any approach is between the gods and their worshippers on an individual level. The gods are perfectly capable of letting us know if new practices or beliefs are displeasing to them. They always have. So long as loud voices shout rhetoric of exclusion, it falls on community leaders to shout back just as vehemently that everyone is welcome, no one acting in good faith for the community and the gods will be excluded, and that every individual practice or prayer is between the gods and the worshipper in terms of effectiveness. I refuse to tolerate one more story of this exclusionary rhetoric turning away someone from a call because they were told that they weren't enough. So long as leaders are honest about the origins of their practices, they harm no one, including those practicing them, and don't claim an unfounded historicity for eclectic traditions, then I and those like me will defend and encourage a plurality of traditions under the umbrella of Hellenism. As I've always said, we're stronger together. It's our responsibility as a community to draw the line in the sand, what we will accept and will not. Because the success and future of our community, our traditions, depends on defining exactly where we stand. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, judge the subscribe button's practice and make sure the like knows it's welcome. Drop down into the comments and let me know where you stand on these issues, and whether or not my position helps make more sense of the kind of content I make and why it can seem so political. Or just tell me I'm appropriating by so much as mentioning these issues and thereby need to go eat worms if that's your speed. It's not like you all haven't been doing that for months anyway. Special thanks also to my patrons. You all stuck through over a month of hiatus, and I thank you so much for that. Patrons actually requested this video when I went over the quality of my content with them earlier this week due to concerns that I always have about whether or not I'm accomplishing what I want to with my work. You all have been such a fantastic support through thick and thin, and I thank you as always for helping enable me to do this work full-time without the need to split my time with another job. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, faith ain't fear.